Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally.
Welcome back, guys, to Lit Happens, where we are talking all things English and all things textual conversations. But today, I'm joined by Belle, and she's going to be giving us great insight into the work of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. Amazing relationship.
Thank you.
Greater work, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
So we'll be looking and diving into the textual conversation. Sort of
relationship, toxic.
Yeah.
Poetry, superb.
100%. So, yeah, we're excited. Thank you so much also to everyone that has been tuning in and listening. But we love your stuff. We'll get straight into it, I guess, Belle, without any further ado here.
Let's do
so
it.
we've been looking at purpose and the purpose of textual conversations in regards to all of the text that we have covered so far. What is the purpose of the Textual Conversations module when we're looking at the works of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Adriel. So I know that the last couple of episodes we've been doing a lot of Mod A, so we've gone over the rubric pretty in depth. So just, really quickly, if you missed it, we're just looking at how a comparative study of text can reveal resonances and dissonances between them. And then there's a real focus on how the newer composer might be actually reimagining or reframing aspects of the original text across time and across context. So, some things to think about, particularly with Plath and Hughes and their texts in Textual Conversations, is the how and the why of their conversation between their texts. So we're going to look at the idea of how they're conversing in terms of their interpersonal worlds and their individual and unique relationship experiences, how they might be representing intrapersonal worlds in their conversation and what's happening more on a societal level, and looking at how language can and ideas can help encourage this intertextuality. So we want to look at their textual dynamics, including context, purpose, and audience, which I'm going to cover real quick, and looking at how those three things influence the values and perspectives, because once you, I think, understand that, it's a lot easier to make those textual connections and start engaging in analysis of intertextuality. But yeah, we're gonna look at some of the commonalities between their poems and the collisions between them, so we have more of a deeper consideration, specifically with Plath and Hughes. Obviously, we're looking at their works, and they're both dialogic, in the sense that we're getting a real insight into not only who they are as individuals, but who they are within their relationships. So for anyone that doesn't know, really, really famous literary couple, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, I guess part of a world when you could be mega famous for being a poet and in literary circles. So maybe like the modern day Instagrammers and stuff like that, I suppose. But I think so. And getting a sense of their really, I guess, vexed or tumultuous relationship. And so we see the resonances and dissonances in almost this like voyeuristic lens, which is like, I think, kind of what students really like about it. It's really he said, she said. But the tensions between these texts, they're going to reveal this complex interplay in terms of ideas of paternal absence. We'll talk about that later. Ideas of liberation, particularly female liberation. We're going to look at like psychological aftermath of trauma. And both of these poets, Plath and Hughes, are engaging in a metaphysical dialogue that's becoming, or serving, I should say, a catharsis, which enables them to confront not only their traumas, but even for Ted Hughes, because he writes it after a big space of time, he's confronting his past and the remnants of their relationship. So if I were just going to quickly get into like the purpose, audience, and context of each of them, I'll start with Plath, since that's the hypertext. So Plath in her confessional poetry is really trying to explore these themes of like personal identity. She's really looking at, trauma, the impacts of trauma, very much so looking at this female experience. And she's using that to articulate her emotional struggles and the existential crisis that not only is she having, but she's projecting out there for many women in this time frame. Because context-wise, it's written in this mid-20th century. We're post-World War II, where women are being kind of forced back into that domestic sphere after, the time spent in total war of World War II. So I think Plath here is, in her poetry, yes, there are poems in her suite of Ariel that are reflecting her own tensions, but a lot of the poetry represents not just the microcosm of her tensions, but on a macrocosm, the battles with the expectations of women and battles with mental health, and really some of her poems do cover the impact of her tumultuous relationship with Ted Hughes. So in terms of an audience, I'd say for Plath, she's really directing it to people that might be interested in feminist literature, definitely in terms of personal narrative because of a stream of consciousness, which we'll cover a bit further down, and anyone kind of interested in that real introspective psychological approach to art and literature as well. And then maybe I'll just jump into Ted Hughes and then we can kind of move on. So just as a recap. Yeah, okay, cool. So, all right, a bit of a disclaimer. Anybody who's teaching this and doesn't know, Plath, I'm going to call her Plath Hughes. Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath actually, is married to Ted Hughes. They have small children. They then separate, and she actually commits suicide. So you might have to, a little bit like we talked about Dunn and Witt and some of those really, adult, difficult themes, you need to be aware of this and perhaps provide a bit of a trigger warning, because Plath in some of her poems is extremely raw in what she's representing. Some of her poems, if you look at Lady Lazarus, there is almost a bit of a suicidal ideation happening, and perhaps a romanticism of death and things like that. So I think like a trigger warning there is really important. So when we're looking at like with Ted Hughes's works, well, he then writes his set of poetry, Birthday Letters, as it's entitled, and he writes this decades after Plath's suicide. So, she passes away. He then he takes over and raises the children. And I think in Sylvia Plath's death, she becomes such a feminist icon and bit of a martyr for the cause because of everything she represented, that Ted Hughes became a very unpopular and controversial figure. Their relationship was marred with, affairs, conflict. So I feel he becomes a bit of a recluse after her death and focuses on his family. And then in I think it's in the 1990s, he's going through his own health battle and crisis, and he starts to write Birthday Letters, which is really his introspection and reflection on his loss, like the loss of Sylvia, the loss of their relationship, and then also a bit more broadly, like the complexity of relationships. And in some respects, perhaps there's some consideration that perhaps he's trying to seek vindication with Birthday Letters. Or like if we're not maybe being that cynical, I think he's trying to reconcile. So this idea of almost now confronting that no doubt difficult past for him, to try and come to terms now, with the consequences of what has happened and with the trauma of losing her and all those things. So yes, bit of a vindication perhaps for her suicide, particularly, because contextually he left her for another woman. So there's a lot that can be read into that, I guess. But, readers of, contemporary poetry and people who also admire Plath, very much a key audience here. Not that Ted Hughes is not famous in his own right. I'm pretty sure he was poet laureate for Great Britain for a long time after her death as well. So he's also a really famous, significant British poet. But I think it's the combination of them together and the way that their lives ended up that really provides interest. A lot of people wanted, birthday letters became a bestseller. Like it's a compilation of poetry, and yet become a bestseller because people, society, literary circles, they wanted to know, they wanted the insight and perspective. So anyone interested in these dynamics of relationships and grief, it's all in there. So yeah, he's really, I guess, then context wise, you can see in the poetry that he's trying to grapple with or make sense of or come to terms or perhaps have his final say on what happened before he passes.
Yeah, you sort of see this with that text, with birthday letters in particular. I recall the poem "Red," for example. It's very much takes that confessional poetry sort of standpoint where we start to see him sort of justify maybe and speak into some of the decisions that were made during their life together and their relationship. So it definitely is full of a lot of meat. You just need to sort of get and dive into it. And I guess moving on from that, what are some sort of teaching strategies for purpose, audience, and context that you would look at for prospective teachers here?
Cool. I think the best way to engage in the rubric really early on is to try and attach those key terms of the rubric and the key meta language to the purpose, audience, and context. So, particularly, like, I think context is so important in understanding the power of their poetry, which, is why, I think assign a research study, offer some biographical context. There is a film version on the life and relationship of Plath and Hughes. I'm not sure of the rating. I have watched it some many years ago. But creating even maybe presentations or infographics where students are trying to really get their mind into like the milieu of that mid 1950s in which their relationship took place, and even documentaries, news articles. There's actually even a lot of news articles like to do with Sylvia Plath's death, how she's remembered as a feminist icon. There's even fascinating footage where soon after Sylvia Plath's death, anywhere that Ted Hughes kind of tried to go, I don't remember if it was a trip to Australia, but I remember there was like news footage of like just women, like feminists, just like attacking him because he kind of became, I think, a bit of that scapegoat. So it's we can tap into that historical context, we can get students to understand how tumultuous the environment was. And I think that will really help them tap into the emotions in the poetry once they get into it. Because it's very personal poetry, this.
It is very personal. And one thing I noticed when teaching this a year or two back was sometimes students can take that sort of, for example, we're looking at that very feminist sort of perspective and, reimagine or reframe it as the sort of verbs in the textual conversations module sort of say. But I would sort of err away from students becoming too fixated with the emotion attached with, a lot of this, like we were saying, people were attacking Hughes because we need to see his work for what it is as well, and how it speaks into the work of Sylvia Plath, I think in particular here.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think the beauty of the poetry is like, you don't have to think one person is more right than another. I think the most fascinating part of this conversation is that there are just going to be different perspectives. We all see the world and experience the world differently, and it's always ultimately he said, she said. We're never going to know who was more right. And we don't need to know. And perhaps there's a point there about the role of memory and the role of truth, and we might talk about that a little bit later. But I agree. I think that's a good starting point to get a sense of the gender issues of the time. But I think if we go just down that lens, we might miss out on some of the really poignant things that Hughes is saying as well.
Yeah, I found that with a few of my sort of students going through this, they got so fixated, and it's like, well, hang on, like, what was some of the purpose of Hughes' work, and how does it speak into some of that feminist movement at that time? Was he really just a person that was to be hated for his actions during their tumultuous relationship, or was there something further that can be revealed through the dialogue that's being had with his poems? So, in saying that, I guess, do you have any tips for students that or teachers that we working towards the higher end for the band 6 candidates in their course?
Yeah, I think so. If we're really trying to connect them to the rubric, you want to really encourage students to like identify and discuss where they're interconnected. So in terms of the experience, we'll look at the thematic concerns. You want to have a look at where there might be resonances or agreement, or where they might be challenging each other, and challenge each other through their poetry. They definitely do. I
100%.
think, it's fascinating. I think as well, like for me, it's like the old school version of like, I guess, Twitter or something, like this is to me like if you have a really big couple right now have a breakup and basically they take shots at each other about their relationship through their tweets, or X or whatever
So
it's called
some
now.
of our older listeners, like, well, I'm saying older,
Uh-huh.
like our age sort of things, probably like those MSN Messenger days where
Yes.
they're going back and
Yes.
forth. I feel as though that might be a thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, because you used to be able to put like a personal little comment in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Facebook posts after that, and then whatever it
That
may
is so
be.
funny. I love that.
But
Yeah,
it's
absolutely. But some other things as well is like the context integration, making sure that they're understanding the different historical, biographical, cultural, and then allowing nuance to happen in there. Alternate perspectives as well, allowing students to consider different and diverse interpretations and perspectives. There are a lot of wonderful, I know you can attest to this, journal articles,
yeah,
things written about the dialogue between them, things written about birthday letters. It's actually, I think, really nice even to get them to read that, even a couple before they start the poetry and then a few more after, and see if their perspective as a student has shifted in light of that as well. And definitely using those resonances and reimagining terms to frame these responses. And then when you're even as a student getting the students to write like comparative paragraphs or even just statements on purpose, audience, context, because these will be useful for their introductions. If they do this now and they can confidently state what each of their purpose, context, audience was, then they've got that ready to go to reshape it for an introduction in future as well.
yeah, yeah, awesome. That sounds good. So we've got a bit, we've covered and spent a bit of time now on purpose. Let's move on to actually focusing in on the text, and we'll start off against with our first text here being Sylvia Plath's Ariel.
Yeah.
What are some of the key themes, maybe concepts and textual
Yeah.
features that teachers should be looking to highlight in Plath's sort of selected poetry in order to sort of move towards that band 6 range for their students?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so if we're looking at Plath's poetry, I've already covered purpose, audience, and context, but just this idea that it's a kind of a polemic against the patriarchy. Not all of her poems, but some of them certainly reflect that. So if you're looking at the poem Daddy, she's really representing her own conflicting emotions about the loss of her father at a really young age, and this idea of being stunted by that. But ultimately, the poem is not only about the struggle for liberation from his loss and pain, but it's a powerful declaration against patriarchal authority. So that's kind of one major issue. We see that in Lady Lazarus too. Another thing that we see as well is in Daddy, Plath actually uses, this metaphor to look at this idea of entanglement that we have with others. So she's entangled with her father and then entangled with her husband. So it reveals that psychological burden and really what the psychological kind of trauma that she's grappling with, which psychological trauma is another big idea. And Lady Lazarus kind of fits that same thematic concern, because that's another confessional poem where she's trying to assert her resilience and ability to rise above trauma and despair and liberate herself. So she used, that imagery of the biblical figure of Lazarus. There's, like a phoenix, she rises from the ashes. So in that one, she's also reflecting this idea of suffering and identity and power and strength. But then she's got a couple of other poems that represent different, more nuanced ideas. So I always think about like Arrival of the Bee Box. She's grappling with feelings of entrapment and anxiety. It's very introspective. the din of the bees is meant to be the chaos kind of in her mindset. So it's this overwhelming mental turmoil and that desire for freedom. So this is where I kind of mentioned that suicidal ideation as well, perhaps, or just the mental struggles that people might be trying to move forward with in their life. And then one more I'll mention, and I'll kind of move on to specific themes and language, is I really like also her poem Nick and the Candlestick. It's a very different take, I think, from her other poems. In this one, she's contemplating this relationship between mother and child, and Nick is actually a reference to her son. So it's, if you look at the tone of it, it's a lot softer. The candlestick is symbolizing like motherhood, light, warmth, and there's a real deep sense of like connection and peace and solace in this poem that I don't think is present in many of her others.
So
But
you've got a few good things there in regards to, I guess, the poems and what they're roughly about. I guess we'll move into like some of the themes and concepts that you'd focus in on for teachers.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So isolation or alienation is a huge one, both emotional and social. We've also got the theme of mortality, so death, the inevitability of death, the fear surrounding death, nature versus nurture becomes a big one too. And this idea of the conflict of the desire of an individual versus what society expects of them. So again, going back to those patriarchal conditions of her time. Creativity as well, passion, creativity, expression, power, art, but also destruction. This idea that like in Lady Lazarus and Fever, like her creativity burns and it's something to fear. So she's sort of like empowering herself with that as well. So I think those are some big themes that you can see across majority of her selection in Ariel.
Cool. So you've got some good sort of things there then in regards to the concepts, themes. We've got to move then into like, well, how are these shown or conveyed? And we start to look at the textual features. So what are some specific textual features that teachers can now move into for Sylvia Plath's work?
So definitely her confessional stream of consciousness style. Very popular style of writing for her in the 1950s, very on trend. Introspection, definitely. Imagery is a big one. The way that she uses imagery and metaphors and other kind of figurative language, she often tries to use them to paint a shocking image to really highlight the strength of her emotion in what she's expressing. And symbolism as well is often carrying, they're often things that are symbolic to her personally, but also have that broader representation of life, death, identity, like the bee box, the candlestick, the fire, those kinds of symbols. In terms of like structure and form for Plath, so she's got a variety. You've got a lot of free verse happening, especially because of that stream of consciousness style, but she likes to play around with like the assonance, the rhythm, the alliteration. She'll use it to build a sense of urgency. Enjambment and fragmentation is really common in her works as well, because she's really trying to shock her reader sometimes. I mean, when you see it, some of her descriptions of where she talks about I'm a cat and I have the 9 lives, and she gives those visuals of her past attempts. It's really meant to be in your face. It's really meant to, I guess, shock the feminine sensitivities of mid-century 1950s. But other kind of specific techniques across her poems, word choice and diction is very important to Plath. Very important. Sometimes she'll use very everyday language, and then other times her terms are really complex, abstract, even historical, depending on what ideas she's trying to bring across. Sound devices are really important to her, and it's why a lot of her poems sound really lyrical. I really encourage, if you can find some on YouTube, there are some, like I know that she does her own reading of Daddy, and it is much more powerful than any English teacher, I think, in the room can do. But you hear it when you hear it spoken. Metaphors and similes for her are really, really powerful personification, particularly personification to look at ideas of like death, despair, these complex feelings. So she's really trying to challenge her post-war and pre-Cold War context. So some of her poems have almost a bit of a nihilistic tone to them. And some of them are really impassioned because of those gender politics and the patriarchal America that she's trying to represent in there.
It's like a little bit of a nutshell, or sorry, a perspective into her little bubble, isn't it, during this time period?
Definitely. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting how a lot of her poems start like that. They start as her as the persona and making that personal commentary, but then you can tell that there's this shift into how it represents the broader world and the broader experience, perhaps.
Yeah. Awesome. So what are some teaching strategies, maybe even band 6 hit tips that we can give teachers here, just working towards this unit and how they can add value to their students?
Yeah, definitely. So when you start off going through each of these Plath poems, let students appreciate each of them for what they are, then look at what commentary they might be making together as a whole, as a set, as Ariel. Remember that this is a selection from Ariel. There are lots of other poems in her collected work that we don't have. So then getting students to think about why these 6 were selected, like what it is about them that represents a big picture, cheat sheets for either each poem or a combination of poems, just to help guide students, because there's a lot happening in Plath's poems in a wonderful way. But sometimes, even if you preface with a cheat sheet, it might help students do that deep engagement. Audio readings of the poem I did mention, close readings, zoning in on specific lines, or actually given certain stanzas or lines to students to engage in close reading, and small group analysis of poem. Definitely give small groups a poem to be like the masters of, and they've got to teach to the class and build the confidence that way, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And what are we looking at in terms of those band 6 students, those higher order thinkers? What are we looking to add for them?
I think the band 6 students will really benefit from you guiding them to evaluate how the poetry is reflecting specific values. So values like individuality or oppression, liberation, trauma. So those kinds of, I think those values become really important, because once students compare that with Hughes, they'll be able to form a kind of concept around that. And encouraging a lot of depth. So moving away from just listing what values being represented, and going more for the function of the technique in representing the idea and then the impact. If students are always thinking of quote, technique, function, impact, they're going to deepen that analytical muscle. And also, making sure that the quotes link to language, link to value, that there's like a kind of circular connection between them. And I would really encourage you to try, your band 6 students will probably be forming some body paragraph analysis on at least a few of the poems, and then moving into Hughes. I think your band 6 students are really going to not block your Plath and Hughes poems per se, but are going to try and do a big picture conversation where they're pulling quotes from a variety of poems, as opposed to here's my big 2 poems that I'm looking at.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well done, Bill. You've got quite a bit of knowledge there regarding Plath's work.
Thank you.
Let's move on now to let's move on to Hughes' collection of work in birthday letters. We'll give a little bit of a background to some of his work, maybe speak into some of how it sort of speaks to the work of Sylvia Plath. And I'll leave the floor to you. You've been doing a fantastic job so far. So keep it up.
No, thank you. You're such a hype man. I love it. Thank you so much. All right. Okay. So in terms of, what's the connection? Why Hughes's poetry to this selection of Ariel? Well, Hughes is talking back to these certain experiences that they've had as a married couple, and those real intricacies of living and being and living your life with another person. So he's really recollecting, because in some of Plath's poems, and I'll cover this a bit more later, but in some of the poems, she's recalling specific events from their marriage, and he's sort of really talking back to them, but maybe allowing more of a consideration of the mental state, the volatility. So he's really almost like looking at her poems and like trying to have this metaphysical conversation back to her. Well, this is not how I saw this. This is how I saw it. Because I'm pretty sure Ariel was published posthumously after her death. So in a way, it's like you could look at it cynically and say this is solely his rebuttal, but also I think this is his closure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree with that idea of closure there.
Mm,
Because that we sort of look at that confessional style again in his work.
yes.
Why would
Yes.
you be looking at a confessional piece of work? This is what I question when I'm sort of teaching this is, well, it does give him a sense of closure because of the tumultuous nature of their relationship. You know, when you think about the ultimate end for Sylvia Plath there, it's not a pleasant ending, is it? Especially the
Yeah.
way we see it manifest in the end. So it definitely does
Mm,
work as something for him as a tool for closure. I love that idea there. But
yeah.
yeah, what do you think? What do you think in terms of some of his poems? What are some of the
Yeah.
poems about? And then maybe we can move into the concepts that you would focus on between the two
Yeah,
texts.
sounds good. Okay, perfect. So, in that regard, birthday letters is a little bit like a counter-offensive.
Mm,
So he's really, I guess, responding in part to the vilification because he was vilified for years after her death.
yeah.
So, in part to that vilification that he faced after her suicide, and also I think as his natural closure, knowing that the end of his life is nearing, and I'm sure
Mm,
we all go through that process, such a universal thing. But one of the poems I think might be a good starting point when students are getting into Hughes's poetry is Fulbright Scholar, which is
mm,
basically him reflecting on the first time he kind of saw Sylvia, and it really foreshadows the tumultuous end that's going to befall them. So it's really interesting in that regard because it's kind of like chronologically the start, but also it's looking ahead into time and then written with that retrospective tone. So
yeah.
that one is also, and it's also really interesting in that one because Hughes kind of portrays himself as feeling as though he was an outsider in the world of Plath, because she was a brilliant,
Mm,
bright woman, like Fulbright scholar.
mm,
Everybody wanted a piece of her, and so it definitely becomes a bit of an idea in his poetry, this idea of him feeling like not enough or a bit of an
yeah.
outsider. Yeah. Another big one, though, is obviously a picture of Otto, which
Yep.
directly links back to Sylvia Plath's daddy. So there's about 3 poems that Sylvia has. Daddy, and then there's also Fever and the Arrival of the Bee Box. And Hughes talks directly back to those, and then the other
Mm,
3 are more general conversations. So in Picture of Otto, he's doing this really metaphysical conversation with Sylvia's father and reconciling the impact of his early death on
yep.
his relationship with Sylvia Plath.
Mm,
And that's, we'll talk about resonances, that's one for sure. This idea of him being this looming figure, he says your
mm,
ghost inseparable from my shadow. So in this one, I really like, though, the underworld imagery that he
mm,
uses. So he's like
mm,
going down into like the catacombs to like
mm,
face off with Otto one last time.
mm,
So it's this idea of being eternally bound to people.
mm.
So
It's
that
very
one's pretty cool.
metaphysical, isn't it? Very
Very, oh,
metaphysical.
very. It's so powerful because it's got that,
Mm,
again, it's got more textuality. It's got that link to like strange meeting.
yeah.
So yeah, there's so much happening. I mean, I,
Mm,
I always struggle to decide which poet I like more. I know I don't need to pick, but
mm,
sometimes I'm like, I like Sylvia's. Oh no, Ted Hughes. I don't, like, they're just so
mm.
rich.
Yeah. I
But the
like that
other
reference that
one,
you've I like
yes,
that reference you've just made to like the strange meeting because
yeah,
those that do like Owens and Sigfrid Sassoon sort of poetry, the trench poets, you'll be like, oh, I've
yes,
heard this before. So there is a lot of intertextuality in his work as well that
yeah,
reflects his
yeah,
time and or the
absolutely,
context. I wouldn't say time, but the context in which he was writing this. He's influenced by quite a
absolutely,
few um, people that have developed great literature. So yeah, no, it's definitely
absolutely.
pretty cool.
And he was really well known for being very what's the word, I've just lost my train of thought, sorry. Oh, sorry, the illusions. He was
Yeah.
very into mythology and
Mm,
classical references, and you
mm,
see that coming up. And in some respects, I think we always think, oh, Hughes was influenced by Sylvia, but Plath's works were influenced by that because she started
yeah.
embedding some of that mythology into her works as well. But the shot, then, Hughes writes something like the shot, which again goes to this entanglement, but it's a real kind of vehement, kind of angry sort of getting it out of his system. He paints her to be like a bullet on this trajectory, and him being caught in this path. So it's very emotional, I think, that one as well. The bee god is really cool, because even though he's talking back to arrival of the bee blocks, because they were a couple famously known for their beekeeping habits. But whereas for Sylvia Plath, she's using the bees and the din to be like the struggle in her mind. He's using it to look at this idea of nature and creativity, and that the Sylvia, if that was your creativity, we just maybe missed that opportunity to harness it. So a deep acknowledgement there for how powerful and creative she was as well. And then you have lastly something like Red, which really gives us the exploration of the psychological state of mind that the couple was in, and namely Sylvia. You talked about that earlier as well, and red was her color, but then it ends with maybe blue was better. So in terms of key themes in his poetry, and I will talk about more connections shortly, but if I'm just looking at his poetry, you've got that idea of nature and what's primal and what's powerful and beautiful in our nature, which is something that Ted Hughes was renowned for in his poetry. Identity and self is coming up again within his poems. Violence, conflict, coming up a bit more deliberately maybe in his poetry. Again, you've got the mortality discussion and the psychological trauma, but I think as well, because he's sort of in closure, reconciling and looking back, you've got this big idea of memory, reflection, interpersonal relationships, as existential ideas, because there is an element in some of his poems like, could I have saved her? Could I have done more? What should I have done? So those are some, I think, of the big kind of thematic things that you will see in those works.
Yeah. And I guess on the top of that, like, what are some of those key language features that you would get teachers to really focus in on? You've mentioned a few already, like, you've made reference to those mythological references. I know you've spoken a lot about imagery, but what are some other things that we can see in his work?
Color symbolism is really obvious in his work, and I'm going to talk about that with Plath as well, but particularly how he's using, like, he uses the colors in the bees to represent like divinity and creativity. Then he uses colors to represent passion, anger, emotion. He's also creates some really nice imagery. Hughes has really concise language. I feel like he says a lot compared to how kind of short his poems are. So it's a real like crafting that he is so precise in every phrase, in every wording, in the syntax. He likes to work a lot with juxtapositions as well. And perhaps that's probably because as well he talks a lot about, Otto or other things that he felt like he was competing with within their relationship. So juxtaposition comes in. Tone and mood. It's really interesting in some of his poems, or that fact that you can go through an array of emotions in his works. So it might start off quite volatile or maybe somber, and then it might end kind of like quite wistful or so there's like a big range. And I already talked about as well the mythological references. But a lot of those allusions that he's using, they sort of become motifs across his work and connect nicely to some motifs with Plath as well.
Yeah, and you've got this idea of like the reframing or the reimagining, which is done through his work, which is birthday letters. Can you just expand on that a little bit there?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so if we're now looking at, all right, so how does his work kind of reimagine these things that Plath have started to address? He's really, I guess, he's trying to come at it from a new insight into their really problematic relationship. And he's trying to kind of articulate his perspectives on the events and the motions that have not only been captured in Plath's work, but have been seen on a societal level and have been used to vilify him. So, some interpretations are that he's trying to revise this narrative surrounding their relationship. or I think perhaps produce a more nuanced view, a more
mm,
humanistic view, because he's really trying to humanize them here in his works. I
mm,
think he's sort of going beyond just, the myth and the legend between Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, but we were really just people with our own problems, with a great
yeah.
tragedy that befell us. So I think he's quite humanizing, and I think he's also reframing some of Plath's perspectives and highlighting her artistry and her legacy in her work.
Mm,
And emphasizing this impact, that while there were aspects of it that was quite maybe toxic and negative, there was a beauty in how much it enriched their artistic, creative senses. So
yeah.
yeah, while he's sort of grappling with like the trauma and the loss in the wake of the death, Hughes is confronting their relationship now in his own perspective and trying to confront this emotional weight of the pain that they both experienced.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And what are some teaching
Mm.
strategies you'd use to teach Hughes poetry? And maybe some
I
band
think,
six tips
yeah,
we could throw in for
sure.
the teachers here.
Okay, sure. So I think when you're teaching it, you can do some fun creative stuff, because there's so
Mhm.
he's so deliberately like virtually having a conversation with Sylvia through his
Yeah.
poems here. You can do some creative tasks like creating a dialogue between them, or a bit of a script perhaps.
Mm,
Socratic
mm,
seminars, I think, are really useful here to look at the nuances of perspective. um, and then even if you're like signposting aspects of Plath's poetry and just agree or disagree. Does he agree or
mm,
disagree? And using that to
mm,
kind of map out, and they'll visually see resonance and
mm,
differences, dissonances, scaffolding to build some
mm,
comparative analysis. Like, you definitely can start with those poems across the two that are more connected, like Bee God and Arrival of the Bee Box. And you can
yeah.
start with those, and then you can bring in the other poetry to add to that
Mm,
conversation.
mm,
And even just charting, different things like a mind map or a chart of the concepts, a separate
mm,
of the theme, the language. You could create that as like a jigsaw activity and getting
mm,
students to kind of piece it all together. But when I'm looking at like band six tips,
mm,
we really want them to reflect and evaluate on how Hughes is reimagining Plath's universal ideas
yeah.
from a more maybe subjective interpretation. So having students to chart the difference between Plath's milieu, but Plath's personal experience, and then how Hughes is connecting back to that. So we want to
Mm,
push for these really perspective links between form, language, and contextual shifts that are encouraging a dialogue for us to see between the two
mm,
poems, a
mm.
metaphysical dialogue.
Yeah. I would also say for teachers that like doing like those mock trial style activities, if you run those mock trials, you can
Mm,
definitely do some mock trials
that's
with
cool.
your Plath and Hughes poetry, who would you sort of maybe create a scenario there and get the students to speak away and watch the world burn in your classroom. So it's
Yeah.
it's a bit of fun. It's a
Yeah.
bit of fun. The
Maybe
kids love
some
it.
ground rules. Oh, it'd be so fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they do love
I
it.
agree. I feel like with this is one of the text combos that I've taught that just have such like strong
Mm,
discussion, and well, I think this and I see that, but then again, and I think that's the engagement that you want. You
mm,
want students to think about this back and forth between them.
yeah. That's fantastic. So I guess we've covered both of the poets there. Now we're sort of looking at the resonances, dissonances, similarities, differences that we sort of see littered throughout the textual conversations rubric there. Let's start by looking at some of the
Mhm.
resonances and dissonances, maybe focusing in on, um, some of the things between the poetry of Plath, obviously, and the birthday letters. What should sort of
Yep.
teachers uncover or look to pinpoint for their students?
Yeah. If I'm looking at like resonances and more mirroring and connections, they're both exploring these concepts of death, identity, and the psychological aftermath of personal trauma. They're both in agreement of kind of the impact it has and the emotional response that occurs. I'll talk about reframing shortly, but I think that that's one. The imagery of nature and how it's being used, the stream of
Mm,
consciousness style and the introspective tone is seen between them. So remember that I would say the teachers and students, the resonances, dissonances don't always have to be just thematic based. Look at their language, look at their structure. Like before Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes was not as confessional in his style. And so he sort of adopted that approach a little bit. And she also was leaning on his representations of nature and mythology in her works as well. Also, this idea of like her own personal struggle, her inner turmoil, her suicide attempts, that's very much a resonance there between the works as well, and looking at the impact that had on their relationship. If I'm looking at dissonances, though, Plath's voice often can be it's a bit more direct sometimes, or she'll maybe position herself more deliberately in the poem. Whereas for some of Hughes's poetry, it's like that, but then he likes to use the mythological and nature to sort of distance at times from the personal narrative. I think in terms of dissonances, there's a big discrepancy between this idea of guilt and blame in the relationship. And I think it's so natural to have that there because, they are people. Nobody wants to feel that they were to blame or responsible for the downfall of a relationship. And that must be a very difficult thing for them to reconcile. In terms of, I think maybe if I go into more the reframings and the imaginings and kind of where the differences occur there. Okay, all right. So nature as a source of power is one that we see being represented. So in the arrival of the bee-box, Plath is looking at this element of nature as being a sense or a sight of her entrapment, and this idea that the environment around her is causing her to feel quite trapped. But what Hughes actually does in The Bee God is he reinterprets this confinement and this struggle to seeing power as nature, as a sense of power, of a life-giving force, of symbolizing creativity and newness. So there's a rephrase of that kind of experience happening there, and also a reframing of all the tension and then anguish within her perhaps may have been channeled better into further creativity. The other one as well is this idea of violence and transformation. So in the shot, Hughes is looking at themes of violence and transformation, particularly in terms of his tumultuous, violent physical relationship with Plath. But that's really contrasting Plath's Lady Lazarus here, where for Plath, it's this personal resurrection amidst this oppression. So this idea that violence and oppression can actually transform and empower us into our, higher forms of self. So for Hughes, violence is sometimes a natural elemental force, but for Plath, she's looking at that as a way to give herself a sense of power in a time where she feels quite powerless, I think.
I would agree.
I think this is probably maybe more of a dissonance as well, too, is this idea of there's this difference between emotional intensity and the primal instinct. So for Plath, well, in Hughes, he's really evoking this more primal instinct, and it resonates some way with Daddy, but Hughes is trying to reframe this within the context of nature's raw power. So he's trying to look at emotion and feelings as part of a natural force to be worked with, whereas for Plath, it was something that she felt was always working against her and causing her turmoil. So I feel like that's a bit of a dissonance and a reframe of that.
You've got a few different ideas.
Yeah. And then probably just one more quick one. I know there's the whole issue of Sylvia Plath's father, Otto, and the thing, but this idea of the existential reflections happening in Hughes's works, he's often meditating on existence through this natural lens and kind of reimagining what was going on in her mind, because he full well acknowledges that he doesn't know. He's not sure. So there's almost this reimagining of perhaps what that struggle was. Whereas for Plath, she's very open with. It's the personal trauma and the struggle she feels with her in her confinement of society. So there's like a bit of a difference there of opinion, I suppose.
Cool. So you've covered a few of those resonances, dissonances as reimaginings and reframing some of those ideas. Maybe can you just quickly go through some of the key ideas and concepts that teachers may look to sort of focus in on? Just as a
Okay, sure. Yeah, so just quickly, some ideas of like what you can do in your body paragraphs, perhaps as a way to anchor your conversation. So one idea is this, identity and self. So for Plath, she's really, you can tell in her poetry, she's navigating her own identity crisis within her works. And whereas Hughes is more so contemplating his identity through the lens of his relationship, there's almost like he feels he's more secure with who he is, but it's this idea of his identity with Sylvia, whereas Plath is trying to work on her own sense of self here. Another kind of concept is like the death and mortality. So both poets examining death, but Plath's poetry looking at it as an escape, whereas Hughes is reflecting on its grief and implications. So there are quite a few poems that I, off the top of my head, that work nicely with that one too. Or even this idea of the nature and the feminine, because Hughes is often using nature to symbolize femininity, whereas Plath is really representing her intense emotional landscape within the confines of her own femininity. And just a couple of other quick concepts. So like the haunting legacy of parental figures or the legacy of trauma. You could also look at like gender dynamics and struggle for identity. I think those are some big kind of concepts that will help you to connect the dots between the poems.
No, and that's quite cool. And then when we sort of look at some of the key language features and tropes, I know we've covered a few when we've discussed the poetry themselves, but what are some sort of little techniques and key features, I guess, tropes that teachers can quickly look at in terms of a focus point between these resonances and dissonances?
Yeah, that's cool. So you can use this trope to kind of anchor your conversation in your body paragraph like you would an ideas. So imagery is obviously one. You've got your figurative language and metaphor. Similarly, your color symbolism. Both poets are using very specific colors between their works to represent themselves and their relationships. So that becomes really obvious. You've got personification occurring across both works, particularly with nature. And there were a couple that spent a lot of their time in nature. The mythic language and sort of the underworld imagery. So, Plath refers to the vampire. Hughes is going down into the catacombs looking for this dark figure in the underground. So you've got that deep, you've got like motifs of nature. You've also got the fact that the titles are the similar titles. That's also a motif. The tone becomes a motif, the allusions. Those are some of the big picture techniques, I think.
Yeah. And do you have any like teaching strategies, any activities that teachers can utilize here?
Yeah, so maybe like some diagrams to map resonances and dissonances. You could create a big one on the back wall or on a wall in your classroom. That would look really cool. And then you could split it off with kind of like shared themes or shared language or shared or similar kind of techniques. Debates to uncover these nuanced interpretations, even using multimedia to draw these connections. So looking at like platforms, Canva, visuals, anything that can kind of allow students to see the connections. And because your band 6 students here, they're going to evaluate with evidence to show dissonance and reflect these value shifts. So they're going to look at the universal experience to the personal experience and how the value shifts between these different contexts and between the different purposes. So you wanna reward this deeper insight. So not just like what's the connection or where are they disagreeing and why, but for what purpose? Like what is the outcome and in what ways is there shifting value, encouraging this reinterpretation?
No, that's awesome. So we've covered some great stuff there with the resonances and dissonances, and you've gotten into quite a bit of depth. Let's finish off now with just the crux, I guess, they're going to be writing in the HSC, and we want to start to look at developing some of those band 6 type thesis statements. So what are
Yeah.
some strategies teachers can use to help students craft some of these compelling thesis statements, linking
Yeah.
both Plath and Hughes for their band 6 type responses?
Okay, so I really like sentence stems or just sentence starters because I find that they're really workable on the board as a whole class or to scatter them around the room. But because if you sort of start off the sentence, you give the students the room to just finish off with an interpretation. So
Yeah.
even you can use these sentence stems when you're analyzing your text, but certainly once you've analyzed them both, and you've looked at connections and now you're trying to move beyond, well, what's the textual conversation, looking at sentence stems like this, these poems or this text raises interesting questions about, or I wonder how this point of view on theme aligns with, or what implications does this interpretation of trauma have for our own understanding of, or how might we interpret mortality differently in light of, or even something like, could we consider the counter arguments, and then how does that affect the overall interpretation? You're just giving these sentence starters to encourage students to finish off with their own thought. I know as teachers we're going to guide them. Module A advanced is not easy, it's quite difficult, but I think more room you give for students to make their own interpretation, they're then going to have a more nuanced essay thesis approach.
Yeah, I agree. So what are some of those essay thesis sort of approaches that you might consider in regards to both of these poems?
Yeah, okay. So you might look at on one level, like more of a structural or language-based level. So how Plath's confessional style might contrast with Hughes's at times detached and more mythical approaches. And I guess how that might highlight the different perspectives of personal trauma and identity. So you can then kind of break it down into those themes in the body paragraph, but they're coming back to this overarching idea. Another one is exploring the theme of death and rebirth. That's a really, really good one. I haven't talked that much about in this analysis, but how that might be depicted in Plath's Ariel and Hughes's Fulbright Scholar. So looking at how each poet might reimagine the concept of resurrection in their work.
Yeah.
And that's quite nuanced. Even a couple more like the representation of nature in either work, and how Plath's internal struggles reflects her environment, and how Hughes uses nature as both like a backdrop and a character when referring back to Plath's work as well.
I love that. So we start to look at a bit of like the ideas of strategies, I guess, and how can we help to build these? So you might have some examples and strategies for teachers to consider for this section here.
Yeah, I think it's good for students to consider a few things. So, like, what role is their cultural context playing in shaping what's happening in the works? How readers are trying to reconcile with the contrasting perspectives, and what implications these contrasting perspectives can have. So, you might actually start by asking them questions like, even a theme or a core or issue based question. How does Hughes's poetry reimagine Plath's portrayal of struggle, of trauma? Or you might actually look at something like Birthday Letters reimagines the poetry of Plath's mid-century interpretations of life and struggle through maybe more of a reconciliatory lens. You might be looking at how textual features are at play here. So how are the authors using titles or color symbolism or illusions to engage in a discussion and explore a central issue? Or you might be looking at more personal perspectives. Students often have, because there's so much in this, I think a lot of students will have their own personal interpretation. Like, I think this is what's at the core of both of their works. I think they're really trying to get us to consider this. So you can ask students, well, what insight or understanding of theirs was challenged in looking at these poetry, and did they come to some sort of resolution or not? And even if they didn't come to a resolution, there's still power in that. What is that meant to do for modern audiences and modern readers of poetry?
Yeah. That looks good. And then I think you're sort of covering quite a bit there in terms of the strategies there, some of the things that teachers can look at. I guess just to sort of give them a few practical types of scaffolds, what would you suggest for them?
Okay, so maybe some scaffolds might be, so you might say something like the hypotext, theme of grief is
Mm,
reimagined by the hypertext technique or motif of to
mm,
reflect the context, and that prompts an insight. So you're getting
yeah.
students to do the building blocks. So what's the
Mm,
theme? How is the theme expressed or connected through some sort of motif? What is it reflecting about their context? And how does that prompt a certain insight or interpretation in a reader?
yeah.
Other things that you might do as well, I think what works is a really good strategy. If students are having trouble kind of forming connections, get them to
Mm,
do a bit of a discursive piece,
mm,
on one idea
love
or
that.
concept or one thematic concern, and get them to just conversationally work through it in a discursive, because that might
Yeah.
actually open their frame of mind for more of a comparison rather than maybe straight judgment calls or,
Yeah.
that way they're actually thinking about the messaging and the different perspectives on the messaging, which is kind of what we want them to do with the resonances and dissonances in this
Mm,
as well, because we
yeah.
want them to reflect on the values. I think that's really good. Making
Mm,
sure your students are drafting. I know
mm,
drafting is always really important, but particularly in Module A, I think it's really good for them to focus on drafting so they can start to intertwine their evidence.
yeah.
There isn't one way of doing things. Like, even if you blocked and you only did certain poems, like, their analysis might still be strong, but typically what you see with the Module A is they're not looking at singular poems or just two or three poems. They're actually
Mm,
looking at aerial, not just these two poems, and birthday letters as a whole, and kind
yeah.
of pulling quotes across the board, trying to get a quote from 3 4 different poems, because there's a broader conversation that's occurring, and that's what they're
Yeah.
trying to represent here as well. So
Okay.
yeah, I think review those theses so that they're
Yeah.
precise, they're aligning, they're focusing on the idea of reimagining. You
Mm,
might want to sort of encourage students to consider if they do have a personal stance and where they might weave that. And if they don't have a personal stance, I think with something like Plath and Hughes as a combo, that's okay, because the truth is quite postmodern here. There's very much an aspect here that you can take a postmodern interpretation or postmodern lens and look at, like subjectivity, author narrative reliability, things like that. But using
yeah.
that meta language to bounce between the texts is essential, I think.
So you've given a few sort of great ideas there in terms of some of those band six tips, I guess, for our students, especially when you're drafting. You do have to make sure that there is I guess, an element of precision with their language, especially when it comes to some of the terms that they're speaking about. And I love that fact that you sort of said, weave their sort of personal critical evaluation into a cohesive argument. I think that's quite essential for the dialogue that you are getting your students to demonstrate through the essays that they're writing. So some fantastic stuff tonight, or today, I should say, today, whenever we're sort of recording this.
Yeah.
Um, but no, well done, Belle. You've definitely taken us through quite a bit of depth and insight into
Yeah,
the
I
works
hope
of
that was
Sylvia Plath and
helpful.
Ted Hughes, and
Yeah.
hopefully everyone has gotten some great bites, some gold out of this, which I definitely have. Even though I'm not teaching it this time around, it's definitely reminded me of a few things,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's fantastic stuff. I think our audience will be loving this. If you have been loving this, please continue to engage with us. I think that's going to be important for us. Leave a comment on what you guys would like to hear or what you thought was great if you are listening to these
Yeah.
episodes, and give us a bit of a a 5-star rating on Spotify gives us a bit more exposure as well. And
Yeah.
follow us on our socials. We are posting quite a bit, few things in few things. I can't even speak at the moment. That will hopefully be
It's that
beneficial
time
for
of
you
term.
guys. Oh, it definitely is. My brain is a mess,
Mm,
but we're loving
mm.
doing this. We're loving the interaction we're having with our community, and what we're starting to build and move forward into. And looking forward to a bit more interaction. I'd love to hear from you guys. I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. I think we'd love to hear what you would like an episode on.
Mm,
Yeah, I think that'd be
mm,
awesome.
be great stuff. Well, thank you once again, Bill, for just a wonderful,
Yeah, pleasure.
insightful walkthrough into the
Yeah.
lives of both Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. I
Yeah.
feel I might have
Fascinating,
to.
fascinating couple.
Yeah,
Yeah.
might have to go read some of the poetry just to divulge, some of the relationships, marital issues maybe that they were having, or
Yeah.
some of these
Yeah.
little things. But
Yeah.
no, well
Get
done.
your emotions out of your system.
That's
Yeah,
right.
it's very
That's right.
powerful stuff. Mm,
That's right. Well done. And I guess we'll leave
thank
it there
you.
for tonight.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for all of our listeners as well. And thank you for your support. We love the encouragement that we've been getting from people both through messages and continue to do so. It gives us a bit of
Yeah.
boost and continues to motivate us. So thank you once again, guys, and we'll see you in our next episode. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.